Colm Bregman had spent 11 days scrubbing grease off his hands under a name that wasn't his own, keeping the patch that usually rode on his back locked in a gym bag in his trunk instead. He'd taken the job to catch a thief, certain the worst he'd find was inflated invoices and padded labor hours. He hadn't expected the thief's favorite target to hand him a manila folder and ask, in a voice gone thin with worry, whether she could really afford one more repair this month. What Colm found inside that folder froze him solid in the middle of the shop floor. Draper Mills, Pennsylvania had 2 auto repair shops left after the third one closed during the pandemic, and Pinnacle Auto Repair had spent the years since building a reputation Colm had only started hearing the ugly side of 6 weeks earlier, when a member of his own chapter, a writer named Presley Cole, mentioned that his mother's repair bills from Pinnacle had nearly tripled since new. Ownership took over 2 years back, for a car that ran the same as it always had. Presley wasn't the only one. 2 more members had similar stories about aging relatives, all of them customers loyal to Pinnacle for decades under its previous owner. A man named Frank Del Vecchio, who'd sold the shop and retired to Florida without any idea what the new owner would eventually turn it into. All of them apparently still trusting a shop that had quietly become something considerably less honest since the sign out front changed hands. Colm Bregman had run the local Hells Angels chapter for 16 years, but before any of that, he'd spent a decade as a working mechanic himself in his 20s and early 30s. The kind of background that meant most members brought him their engine trouble before they brought it to a shop, his own garage at home still better equipped than some professional operations in the county. He decided, after the third story reached him, that the fastest way to know for certain what was happening inside Pinnacle was to see it from the inside. Applying for an open mechanic position under his middle and mother's maiden name, Colm Aldrich, and keeping every trace of his actual life locked away for the length of the job, telling only his vice president and Presley where he'd actually gone for the length of the assignment. Before we get to what was in that folder, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to that shop floor, where a woman who had no idea, who was actually standing across the counter from her, was about to hand a Hells Angels president the exact proof he'd gone undercover looking for, and hand him something considerably heavier than proof along with it. Agnes Whitmore was 76 years old and had been bringing her car to the same building on Route 4 for 31 years, first under the previous owner who'd known her husband Edwin by name, and then, without fully registering the change in ownership, under Grant Sowell, who bought the shop 2 years back and kept the same sign out front specifically because regulars like Agnes never thought to question a business that looked exactly the way it always had. Edwin had died 2 years earlier of a sudden heart attack while working in the yard, leaving Agnes alone in the house they'd shared for 44 years. Her car the one piece of independence she had left in a life that had otherwise shrunk considerably since his death. Grocery runs and doctor's appointments, and Sunday visits to his grave, all depending entirely on an engine she understood nothing about, and had never once needed to, since Edwin had always handled anything mechanical between the two of them without her giving it a second thought. Grant Sowell had built his ownership of Pinnacle around a simple, ugly calculation. Elderly customers, especially widows without a spouse left to double-check the math, rarely questioned a repair bill, rarely sought second opinions, and almost never complained loudly enough to cost him real business. A pattern he'd apparently studied and refined over 2 years of ownership until it ran like a second unofficial business model layered quietly under the visible one. He inflated invoices with invented labor hours, replaced parts that didn't need replacing, and had trained his newer hires, quietly and without ever putting it in writing, to flag exactly this kind of customer for what he called the premium service package. a euphemism every mechanic on staff understood to mean charge whatever the account could plausibly bear. He kept a mental list of which customers pushed back on a bill and which ones never did, and had learned, with the specific cynicism of a man who'd stopped seeing customers as people, exactly how far he could push the second group before anyone noticed. Grant assigned Agnes's car to Colm that Thursday specifically, telling him under his breath before she'd even finished checking in that she was good for at least $400 in whatever Colm could find wrong with it, an instruction delivered with the casual confidence of a man who'd given it 100 times before and never once had it questioned. Colm ran a full, honest diagnostic instead, checking every system twice out of the same habit that had made him a good mechanic decades earlier, and found nothing wrong with the car beyond a wiper blade due for replacement, a $5 part. He was trying to work out how to explain that to Grant without blowing his cover when Agnes, waiting in the shop's small front office, struck up a conversation with him through the open service window, the kind of easy, lonely talkativeness of a woman who didn't get many chances anymore to simply be heard by someone who seemed to be listening. She told him about Edwin without being asked. The two of them married 44 years, him gone 2 years now, and how strange it still felt some mornings to make coffee for one person instead of two, pouring the second cup out of habit some days before she caught herself. She told him she kept coming to Pinnacle because Edwin always said the shop did right by them, and she didn't feel she had the knowledge herself to know if that was still true now that he wasn't there to ask. Then, almost as an aside, she asked Colm, since he seemed like an honest sort, whether he thought it was normal for a car this old to need so much work so often, and pulled a worn manila folder out of her purse, the kind she said she'd started keeping after the third time a bill had come in higher than she expected, wanting some record in case she ever needed to make sense of it, though she admitted she'd never quite worked up the nerve to ask anyone to actually look through it with her until now. Colm opened the folder at her invitation, and the invoices inside, going back nearly 3 years, told a story considerably worse than he'd braced himself for. $14,000 in repairs on a car worth perhaps $6,000. Charges for parts replaced multiple times within months of each other. Labor hours billed that no job on that vehicle could plausibly have required. The pattern unmistakable to anyone who actually knew what they were looking at. Agnes, watching his face rather than the folder since she couldn't read his expression from where she sat, asked quietly whether something was wrong. Colm closed the folder slowly, choosing his next words with more care than he'd chosen anything in longer than he could remember. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "how much of this did you pay out of your husband's pension?" "Most of it," she said. "I've had to be careful with some other things because of it. My blood pressure medication. Mostly. I split the pills some months to make the bottle last longer, and my doctor doesn't know that yet, so please don't say anything." She said it plainly, without self-pity, the way people say things they've already made peace with, and it was that particular plainness, more than the dollar figure itself, that froze Colm completely. Standing there in a stranger's coveralls with a name that wasn't his own, looking at a woman who'd been quietly bleeding out financially for 2 years while skipping her own heart medication to keep paying for repairs her car never needed in the first place. He thought, standing there, of his own mother, gone 11 years now, and how easily she might have ended up in exactly this chair asking exactly this question if she'd lived long enough and lost the right person at the wrong time. Colm didn't confront Grant that day. He spent one more week gathering records, photographing invoices when Grant wasn't looking, and quietly identifying at least 6 other elderly customers with patterns matching Agnes's folder almost exactly. Cross-referencing names against the shop's own filing cabinet during a lunch break when the office sat empty, before walking into the county consumer protection office with a stack of evidence, considerably more damning than his own testimony alone, would have been. He revealed who he actually was only once the investigator asked how he'd gotten access to internal billing practices in the first place, and the investigator, to her credit, didn't blink at the answer, telling him afterward that most whistleblower cases she'd handled came from disgruntled employees rather than a motorcycle club president working undercover on his own initiative, but that she'd take a solid case however it arrived. Grant Sowell was charged with multiple counts of consumer fraud within the month, the investigation eventually identifying 11 victims total, most of them elderly, several of them widows managing fixed incomes exactly like Agnes's. He surrendered his mechanic's license as part of a plea agreement that spared him trial, but not restitution. A judge ordering him to repay every dollar the investigation could document, a sum that came to just over $90,000 across all 11 victims combined, payable on a schedule the court would enforce with wage garnishment if Grant fell behind. Calm told Agnes who he really was the same week the charges were filed, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table rather than a shop counter, and watched her go through disbelief, embarrassment, and finally something closer to relief once she understood the full scope of what had actually happened to her. "I thought I was just bad with money," she told him. "I thought it was my fault for not understanding cars well enough." Combe shook his head. "It was never your fault," he said. "He built a whole business around betting that good, trusting people wouldn't ask questions. You asked the exact right one. You just asked it to the wrong person for 2 years, and the right one finally happened to be standing across the counter. Engines, that was the sound filling Agnes Whitmore's driveway the following Saturday. A modest turnout by the chapter's usual standard, just under 40 riders, but every one of them there specifically for her. The chapter had covered the restitution gap for the 2 months it would take Grant's court-ordered payments to actually start arriving, collecting the sum informally among members within days once Calm explained the situation at a single meeting, and a member who ran his own honest repair shop 2 towns over volunteered to service Agnes's car for free for as long as she owned it, checking in personally every 3 months whether she asked him to or not, writing his cell number on a card and taping it to her glove box himself. Presley Cole's own mother, one of the 11 identified victims, sat with Agnes on the porch that Saturday, the 2 women swapping stories about invoices that no longer made either of them feel foolish now that they understood exactly what had been done to them, comparing notes on which repairs had been billed to both of them within weeks of each other. The same fabricated labor charge appearing on both invoices almost word for word. Agnes still drives the same car, wiper blade finally replaced properly, and has Calm's actual number saved in her phone now under his real name, calling him every so often just to talk the way she used to talk to Edwin about nothing in particular. Updates about the garden or a neighbor's new dog, rather than anything urgent. She told a local reporter covering Grant's sentencing that the hardest part of the last 2 years hadn't been the money. It had been believing she was foolish for trusting a business the way her husband always had, and that finding out she wasn't foolish at all had mattered to her almost as much as the money the court eventually made Grant pay back. She has since gone back on her full prescribed dose of blood pressure medication, and told Calm at their last visit that her doctor had noticed the difference before she'd even mentioned it. Combe went undercover looking for a thief. He found a widow who'd been quietly bleeding out a little at a time for 2 years, and made sure, alongside 40 riders who'd never met her before that Saturday, that the bleeding finally stopped. If you believe the people least likely to ask for help are often the ones who need it looked for hardest, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.